A black woman repaired his Mustang. Then the car wasn't just broken, it was evidence. This might be the best story you'll hear today. Enjoy it. The pre-dawn darkness clung to Chicago's South Side like a stubborn memory. Dorothy Washington pushed open the heavy garage door of Washington Auto Repair, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid March air. The fluorescent lights flickered to life, casting harsh shadows across rows of tools that gleamed like surgical instruments. Each wrench, each socket, each diagnostic machine represented 20 years of building something from nothing. A sanctuary where engines found their voice again, where broken things became whole. Dorothy moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to take up space without apology. At 45, her hands bore the honest scars of countless repairs, her dark skin weathered by years under hoods and overtime under pressure. The embroidered name on her Navy coveralls, D. Washington, owner and operator, wasn't just identification. It was a declaration of independence earned through sweat, stubbornness, and an unshakable belief that excellence spoke louder than prejudice. The rumble of a powerful engine interrupted her morning ritual of checking the day's work orders. Through the grimy window, she watched a midnight black Ford Mustang GT prowl into her lot like a predator claiming territory. The car's paint job caught the early light pristine and arrogant. Even before the driver emerged, Dorothy felt something shift in the air, the particular tension that preceded trouble. Colonel Marcus Bradley stepped out of the Mustang with the bearing of a man accustomed to immediate compliance. His army dress uniform was immaculate, pressed to razor-sharp creases that could cut glass. Silver eagles gleamed on his shoulders, but it was his eyes that commanded attention, cold, calculating, and already dismissive as they swept across the modest garage. "I need to speak with the owner," he announced, without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been told no. Dorothy wiped her hands on a shop rag, meeting his gaze steadily. "You're speaking to her." The colonel's expression shifted from impatience to something approaching disbelief. His eyes traveled from her coveralls to her work boots, lingering on the owner patch, as if it were written in a foreign language. "You run this place, built it from the ground up." Dorothy replied, her tone remaining professionally neutral, despite the familiar sting of assumption. "What can I do for you?" Bradley's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He gestured toward the Mustang with military precision. "Engines making noise. Steering pulls left. I need it fixed. Today." Dorothy walked to the vehicle, running her experienced eye over its lines. Even from a distance, she could hear the telltale rattle of a worn timing chain and see the slight uneven wear on the front tires that suggested alignment issues. "I'll need to run diagnostics. Full repair will likely take 2 to 3 days, depending on parts availability." "Unacceptable." The word cracked like a whip. "I'm Colonel Bradley, stationed at Fort Sheridan. I have a meeting with General Patterson tomorrow morning. This isn't a request, it's a priority." Dorothy's military training, buried but never forgotten, recognized the implicit threat in his tone. She had served 8 years as a combat engineer, had taken orders from men like Bradley, had learned when to push back and when to stand firm. "Colonel, with respect, I don't compromise on safety or quality, not for anyone." Bradley stepped closer, lowering his voice to a conversational level that somehow felt more menacing than shouting. "Listen carefully. I can make your little operation here very profitable. Steady contracts, regular maintenance schedules, military referrals, or—" He paused, letting the alternative hang in the air like smoke. "You can keep playing the stubborn independent and watch your customer base disappear. Your choice." The threat was so boldly stated that Dorothy almost admired its efficiency. Almost. "I appreciate the offer, but I've built my reputation on honest work and fair pricing. That's not changing." "Fair pricing?" Bradley laughed, but there was no humor in it. "We'll see about that. Just remember, people like me decide where the money flows in this town. You might want to consider which side of that flow you want to be on." So after 48 hours of meticulous work, Dorothy had the Mustang purring like a contented cat. New timing chain, wheel alignment, brake fluid flush, and a dozen minor adjustments that transformed the vehicle from problem to precision instrument. She calculated the bill carefully, 1847s including a 10% military discount that brought it well below market rate for the extensive work performed. When Bradley returned, his mood seemed improved, almost friendly. That should have been Dorothy's first warning. "All finished," she said, handing him the itemized invoice. "Everything's detailed there, parts, labor, diagnostics. You'll find the military discount applied at the bottom." Bradley's eyes scanned the paper, and his expression transformed like a switch being thrown. The friendly mask vanished, replaced by something ugly and familiar. $1,800 for what? Highway robbery. "Every item is listed and priced fairly," Dorothy replied calmly. "You can verify costs with any—" "Don't lecture me about costs." Bradley's voice rose, attracting attention from other customers in the waiting area. "You people are all the same. See a uniform and think it's Christmas morning. Well, I've got news for you, sister. I'm paying $1,200, and that's being generous." Dorothy felt the familiar burn of injustice, but her voice remained steady. "Colonel, the work was extensive and the price is fair. You can pay the full amount, or we can discuss a payment plan." Bradley slammed his credit card on the counter with enough force to make the coffee cups jump. "I'll pay your extortion this time, but this isn't over. You think you're clever running your little scam in this neighborhood. I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of operation you're running here." The worst part wasn't just the accusation. It was the audience. Other customers shifted, uncomfortably, some nodding slightly, as if Bradley's words confirmed their own suspicions. Dorothy had spent 2 decades building trust in this community, and she could feel it cracking with each word. As Bradley drove away, his parting glare through the windshield carried a promise that made Dorothy's stomach knot with dread. What followed felt like warfare by whisper campaign. Within days, Dorothy's phone rang with cancellations. Longtime customers suddenly discovered other mechanics. Her online reviews, previously glowing, became infested with anonymous complaints about overcharging and unprofessional service, and worse, much worse. The base's unofficial communication network, more efficient than any military intelligence, operation spread Bradley's version of events like wildfire. Washington Auto Repair became shorthand for everything wrong with civilian contractors. Dorothy's name appeared on unofficial blacklists, shared in group texts and coffee shop conversations. Marcus Webb, her young assistant, watched the daily tally of lost business with growing alarm. "Ms. Washington, maybe we should fight back online, respond to these reviews?" Dorothy shook her head, watching another regular customer drive past without stopping. "Truth has its own timeline, Marcus. Sometimes it just takes longer than lies." But privately, she wondered if truth would arrive before her business died. The end came not with a whisper, but with a thunderclap. 2 MPs in full uniform arrived on a Tuesday morning, their expressions grim with official purpose. Dorothy was elbow deep in the engine bay of a Honda Civic when their shadows fell across. Her work. Dorothy Washington. The senior officer's voice cut through the garage's ambient noise. "You're under investigation for possible tampering with military property. You need to come with us." The words hit like physical blows. Dorothy's hands, steady through decades of precision work, began to shake. "I don't understand. What property, what tampering?" "Colonel Bradley's vehicle. A suspicious package was discovered during routine inspection. Chemical residue suggests possible explosive materials." The MP's tone was professionally neutral, but his eyes held the particular judgment reserved for suspected terrorists. The handcuffs clicked shut with a sound that would haunt Dorothy's dreams. They walked her out of her own garage, past Marcus's horrified face, past customers who stepped back as if guilt were contagious. By the time they reached the squad car, a small crowd had gathered. Neighbors, customers, passers-by, drawn by the spectacle of another black woman being taken away. "Told you something wasn't right about that place," someone whispered loud enough to be heard. The holding cell smelled of disinfectant and desperation. Dorothy sat on the narrow bench, staring at her hands, the same hands that had rebuilt engines, that had wielded tools with surgical precision, that had never touched anything more dangerous than carburetor cleaner. 16 hours passed in that grey limbo, marked only by the arrival of watery coffee and stale sandwiches. When the public defender finally arrived, his exhaustion was visible from across the room. "Mrs. Washington, I'm David Chen. I'll be representing you. I have to be honest, this looks serious. The chemical residue, your access to the vehicle, the timeline. The prosecution has a compelling case." Dorothy found her voice. "It's a setup. I never put anything in that car except honest repair work. Chen nodded wearily. That's what they all say. Released on bail that consumed her emergency savings, Dorothy returned to find her garage transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape fluttered from the doors like broken promises. Spray paint across the windows spelled out "terrorist" and "go back to Africa" in jagged red letters that looked like wounds. She stood in the ruins of her life's work and felt something. Fundamental break inside her chest. Not her spirit, that had survived worse, but her faith in fairness, in the possibility that hard work and honesty could overcome prejudice and power, lay shattered like the broken glass beneath her feet. That night, alone in her apartment above the garage, Dorothy did something she hadn't done since her mother's funeral. She wept. Deep, racking sobs that seemed to come from some ancient well of grief. She cried for the young woman who had believed the military would teach her a trade and treat her fairly. She cried for the entrepreneur who had thought that owning her own business would mean controlling her own destiny. Most of all, she cried for the community she had served faithfully, for 20 years now turned against her by lies, dressed up as patriotism. But as the tears dried, something else emerged, something harder and more dangerous than grief. Dorothy Washington had spent her life fixing broken things. Now it was time to fix a broken system. She began with what she knew: evidence documentation, facts that couldn't be twisted by prejudice or power. Security footage from her garage's cameras, showing every moment of Bradley's visits. Receipts and work orders, itemized and time-stamped. Digital records of online harassment, traced to accounts. Connected to Fort Sheridan personnel. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: her own thoroughness. Dorothy's habit of photographing vehicles before and after repair work had captured something crucial. Images of Bradley's Mustang showing the interior completely clean before work began, and the mysterious, suspicious package visible in photos. Taken by military investigators. The package wasn't just planted, it was planted badly by someone unfamiliar with the vehicle's interior. The staging was obvious to anyone who looked carefully. Unfortunately, careful looking wasn't something military investigators had done. Dorothy carried her evidence to the office of Rebecca Martinez, a civil rights attorney, whose reputation for taking on impossible cases was matched only by her success rate. Martinez studied the documents with the intensity of a general planning. An invasion. "This isn't just fraud or harassment," Martinez said finally. "This is a systematic attempt to destroy you using military resources and personnel. Under the Military Accountability and Civil Rights Protection Act, this constitutes a federal civil rights violation. We're not just going to clear your name. We're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else." The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago had seen its share of David and Goliath battles, but few as stark as United States versus Bradley and the case of Washington versus Fort Sheridan Command. Structure. Dorothy sat at the plaintiff's table, her Sunday best a stark contrast to the power suits surrounding her, but her posture spoke of someone who belonged exactly where she was. Colonel Bradley, flanked by military attorneys, looked smaller somehow. In civilian court, his uniform, which had been a weapon of intimidation in Dorothy's garage, seemed merely costume-like under the harsh courtroom lights. The evidence spoke with mathematical precision. Security footage showed Bradley's car arriving clean and leaving clean. Military investigators' photos showed the planted evidence appearing days later. Digital forensics revealed that the anonymous online attacks against Dorothy originated from computers on Fort Sheridan. But the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source: Sergeant Patricia Gonzalez, a military investigator whose conscience had finally overruled her orders. "Colonel Bradley approached me directly," Gonzalez testified, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said the Washington woman was a threat to military contracts and needed to be dealt with. He provided the materials found in the vehicle and instructed me on where to place them during the inspection." The courtroom erupted. Bradley's attorneys objected strenuously, but the damage was beyond repair. Judge Patricia Williams, herself a veteran, and the first black woman appointed to the federal bench in the Northern District of Illinois, listened to closing arguments with the intensity of someone who understood that this case represented more than one woman's fight for justice. This court finds that the defendants engaged in a systematic pattern of harassment, fraud, and civil rights violations, Judge Williams announced. Mrs. Washington was not merely the victim of one man's prejudice, but of an institutional failure that allowed that prejudice to weaponize military resources against an innocent citizen. The judgment was comprehensive. Bradley faced federal charges for abuse of power and filing false reports. Fort Sheridan command structure faced mandatory civil rights training and oversight. Dorothy received compensation not just for lost business, but for the violation of her fundamental rights as an American citizen. But the real victory came in the courtroom's aftermath. Judge Williams made her ruling the foundation for new military guidelines on civilian contractor relations and civil rights protections. The Washington Protocols became standard operating procedure across all military installations, ensuring that civilian contractors had clear appeals processes and protection from harassment. 6 months later, Dorothy stood before the National Association of Minority Contractors annual convention, addressing an audience of entrepreneurs who looked like her and had fought similar battles. The garage behind her was not just rebuilt, but expanded with 2 new bays and a waiting room that displayed her federal commendation for service to community and country. They thought one lie could destroy 20 years of truth, Dorothy said, her voice carrying to the back of the packed auditorium. They thought military rank could override American justice. They thought a black woman with tools was an easy target. She paused, looking out at faces that reflected her own journey, scarred but not broken, tested but not defeated. They were wrong on all counts. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, but Dorothy barely heard it. She was thinking about the young black woman in the 3rd row taking notes frantically, who had approached her after the speech with questions about starting her own automotive business. She was thinking about the calls she'd received from small business owners facing similar harassment, looking for guidance and hope. Most of all, she was thinking about the Mustang, how Bradley had brought it to her garage as a weapon of intimidation, never imagining it would become the vehicle that carried justice not just to her doorstep, but across the country. Dorothy Washington had spent her life fixing broken things. In the end, she had fixed something that had been broken far longer than any engine, the belief that power would always triumph over truth, that institution would always defeat individual, that being black and female in America meant accepting less than full citizenship. She had proven that sometimes when you refuse to stay in the place others have assigned you, you don't just change your own life. You change the landscape itself. The system that had tried to crush her now bore her name in its protections. The man who had threatened to erase her had been erased from service himself. And in garages and small businesses across the country, the Washington Protocols ensured that what happened to Dorothy Washington would never happen again. Sometimes justice arrives like lightning, swift, brilliant, and impossible to ignore. Sometimes it comes like dawn, gradually, inevitably illuminating everything it touches. In Dorothy's case, it came like a perfectly tuned engine, smooth, powerful, and built to last. Have you ever experienced or witnessed institutional harassment based on race or gender? Share your thoughts in the comments. Dorothy's victory echoed far beyond the federal courthouse. Within weeks of the judgment, the Washington Protocols became mandatory reading at military installations nationwide. The Department of Defense issued new guidelines requiring third-party oversight for any investigation involving civilian contractors who were minorities or women. Her case study became part of military academy curricula on leadership ethics and civilian relations. But the real impact was measured in phone calls from small business owners who had been afraid to fight back against powerful customers, in emails from minority contractors who found new courage to bid on military contracts in the young woman, who opened her own garage in Detroit and sent Dorothy a photo of her first military contract. The expansion of Washington Auto Repair included something new, a small conference room, where Dorothy held monthly workshops for minority entrepreneurs facing discrimination. The sessions were always full, the stories depressingly similar, but the outcomes increasingly hopeful, as attendees learned to document everything, build alliances, and never accept that being stepped on was the price of doing business. On the first anniversary of Judge Williams' ruling, Dorothy received an unexpected visitor. General Patricia Harrison, the new commanding officer at Fort Sheridan, arrived not in uniform, but in civilian clothes, driving her own car that clearly needed work. "Mrs. Washington, I've come to apologize on behalf of the United States Army," General Harrison said. "What happened to you was inexcusable, and it took too long to make it right. I'm also here to ask, would you consider handling the maintenance contract for our fleet of non-tactical vehicles, fair bid process, transparent pricing, and the kind of professional relationship you deserved from the beginning?" Dorothy looked at the General's car, listening to the telltale knock of carbon build-up in the engine. "What seems to be the problem?" she asked, popping the hood with the practiced ease of someone who had found her calling. As she worked, General Harrison talked about the changes at Fort Sheridan: new leadership, new policies, new respect for the civilian contractors who kept military operations running smoothly. But Dorothy was only half listening. She was thinking about the young mechanic she'd been fresh out of service and full of dreams. That woman had believed that hard work and fairness would be enough. She'd been naive, but not wrong. It had just taken longer than expected for the world to catch up to her faith. The General's car pulled away with a much healthier engine sound, and Dorothy watched it disappear into traffic. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, now managing the shop's second location. "New customer wants to schedule maintenance for her food truck fleet. Says she heard you're the person to trust with important jobs." Dorothy smiled, wiping her hands on the shop rag that bore her name. She had learned something important in her battle with Bradley and the system he represented. Truth was like a well-tuned engine. It might take time to warm up, but once it was running, it could take you anywhere you needed to go. The neighborhood around Washington Auto Repair had changed too. Property values rose as the area became known for Dorothy's successful fight against institutional discrimination. Young professionals, many of them minorities, moved in and opened businesses. A cafe run by a Latina veteran, a law office specializing in civil rights, a financial consulting firm founded by a black woman who had been inspired by Dorothy's story. The annual Neighborhood Business Association meeting was held in Dorothy's expanded waiting room, where the federal commendation hung beside her original business license and a photo of her shaking hands with Judge Williams. As president of the association, Dorothy looked around the room at faces representing dreams realized and barriers broken. 5 years ago, some of you might not have felt welcome in this neighborhood, she said to the gathered entrepreneurs. Today, you're not just welcome, you're the reason this community is thriving. That's what happens when people refuse to accept limits others try to place on them. The applause was warm but brief. These were working people with businesses to run and families to feed. But as they filed out into the Chicago evening, Dorothy caught fragments of conversation that warmed her heart: partnerships being formed, resources being shared, the kind of mutual support that turned individual success into community strength. Later that evening, Dorothy stood in her garage after closing, running her hand along the workbench where she'd first confronted Bradley's arrogance. The tools were the same, her skills had only grown, but everything else had transformed. The scared woman who had once wondered if truth would arrive before her business died had become someone who helped others find their own courage to fight back. Her reflection caught in the chrome of a customer's pristine Harley-Davidson, and Dorothy barely recognized herself, not because she looked different, but because she carried herself differently, with the confidence of someone who had been tested by fire and emerged not just intact, but stronger. The Washington protocols had prevented dozens of similar cases across the country. Young contractors called her for advice, knowing she understood their struggles. Military commanders sought her input on improving civilian relations. Law schools used her case to teach about institutional change through individual courage. But Dorothy's greatest pride wasn't in the systemic changes or national recognition. It was in the young mechanics, male and female, black and white and brown, who worked in her expanded shop with the confidence that their skills mattered more than anyone's prejudices. It was in Marcus now, part owner of the business, who had learned that fighting for what's right was as important as fighting for what's profitable. Most of all, it was in the knowledge that the next black woman who walked into a garage or a boardroom or a courtroom would find the path a little clearer, because Dorothy Washington had refused to accept that knowing her place meant accepting less than she deserved. The Mustang that had started it all was long gone, but its lesson remained: sometimes the very weapon meant to destroy you becomes the tool that builds something better. Dorothy had taken Bradley's attempt to crush her spirit and turned it into a foundation for justice that would outlast them both. As she locked up the garage and headed home, Dorothy's phone buzzed with a notification. Another 5-star review, this one from a young veteran who had just opened his own auto shop in Atlanta. "Ms. Washington didn't just fix my car, she fixed my faith in fairness. If you want honest work from someone who understands what it means to serve with honor, this is your place." Dorothy smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new customers, new opportunities to prove that excellence was colorblind and justice was worth fighting for. She had learned that sometimes the most powerful victory wasn't revenge against those who had wronged you, but building something so strong and true that it would protect others from facing the same battles. The engine of change, once started, never really stops running. It just keeps moving forward, carrying hope to places that had forgotten what it looked like. Change isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's as quiet as a woman refusing to accept limits, as persistent as truth wearing down lies, as powerful as justice finally catching up to injustice. Dorothy Washington's story reminds us that the courage to stand up for what's right doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to sit down. In a world that often feels broken, the tools to fix it are usually closer than we think. In our hands, in our hearts, and in our unshakable belief that things can be better. You are amazing. If you genuinely enjoyed this story, please leave a like and subscribe. It's a great feedback for me. If it made you feel seen, heard, or simply reminded you that change is still possible, share it with someone who needs a little hope today. See you.